We already saw that in the previous video that Photoshop is not only useful when it comes to working with images, but apart from importing video files and creating frame animations, you can even work with three-dimensional objects. And the way that Photoshop handles that is by using 3D layers. In this video, I'm going to show you a few examples of how to make the most of these features. But once again, some of these you might not be able to find if you have earlier versions, so if you are not a Creative Cloud subscriber. The first example is just a simple photograph, which I'm going to turn into a three-dimensional spherical panorama. That sounds very technical, but believe me, it's a really fun feature. So all you have to do is to have an image ready, and then go to the 3D menu, from which you choose New Mesh from Layer, Mesh Preset, and Spherical Panorama. There's so many other options here, but let me just click on that one, which will then turn the image into a sphere. And if we start using these tools here on the top, which I use for three-dimensional navigation, and you will see these in case you have the Move tool selected, I will be able to zoom out with this tool, so we can see a little bit more of what we have here. And you will see that the whole image became a ball. And we can rotate this around and see all sides of it. But most interestingly, we can enter this, so we can go inside, and inside we will see the same things, but in a different perspective. So it almost feels like we can look around within the image. So it feels like being there. And you can use this as part of an animation, because the most interesting thing is that you can animate three-dimensional shapes or even the movements of the camera. So what I'm just doing now here, I could animate with the timeline panel and render it out into a video. Once again, why do we need this in Photoshop? Well, Photoshop is not a dedicated 3D software, but having these features available allows us to again use all the techniques we've learned before for images and apply it to three-dimensional objects or even animations. So if you look at the layers panel, we can see that this background layer is now a 3D object or 3D layer. But if I use adjustments, let's say curves on top of this, and choose increase contrast or even strong contrast, it will work exactly the same way as if we were applying this on a normal image layer. So going back to my layer, I can still move around, and now I see the increased contrast on the 3D image. But let me go to the next example, where we have again starting from a photograph, and we go to Filter, Vanishing Point. We used this in an earlier video, and I already went ahead and prepared the grid or the planes for this tunnel. So as you can see, I have all these planes prepared here. And what I'm going to do now is to click on this drop down here and choose Return 3D Layer to Photoshop. So that will turn all these planes into a 3D layer. Once I click OK, you will see what happens. I'm just going to click OK on this as well. So it just sets up the 3D scene. And you can see now we have a separate layer. I can turn off the original one. And once again, using the same tools from within the Move Tools options, I can now turn around and move this whole scene upside down. So I can look around within the tunnel. And if we zoom out, you can see exactly what happened here. So we have a 3D space within which I can zoom in, zoom out. So once again, an original photograph that now works in 3 dimensions. And by the way, if you feel like you need to improve some textures, they are all available to edit here on the right. You can see the top plane is a separate texture, or this one on the right, also this one in the front. So I can always double click on these textures and edit them individually. You can see that the details that were closer to us are going to be much more detailed than graffitis in the background. They get more distorted because of the perspective we had in the photograph. So textures are almost like smart objects. They will be separate documents which you can improve, and then once you made your changes, you can come back to the original file. But even better than that, you can use the brush tool or any of the other tools directly on top of the 3D objects. And look at that, when I continue drawing, it shows which plane I'm drawing on. But let's switch again to another example. And here I have some text. You might remember also this in another video where I showed you how to turn some text into 3D. And that's exactly what I'm going to do here as well, but I'm going to raise the game. So I have this text layer selected, and here on the top, I'm going to click on 3D. For this, you have to have the type tool selected to get the option on the options bar. So once I click on that, we will get the 3D text, and I can already start rotating it around. Now, first of all, I don't want it to be so wide. So I will open up these two panels, which are probably the most useful one when you work with 3D layers, the 3D panel and the properties panel. So having the text object selected from the 3D panel, I can reduce the depth, the extrusion depth, something like that. And then having the current view selected, I can change the perspective applied on the text. So we can increase the perspective and then just zoom closer to it. So bring it closer to us, but you will see that it will have a stronger perspective on it already. Okay, so let's just have it set up somewhere around here. I'm just going to move my screen slightly. Okay, that works quite nicely in the scene. I want to make sure it fits in the perspective in the image, or at least it gets close to it. So I'm watching all the grid lines as well. If I want, I can also change the light source. So I just selected the light source from the 3D panel and I can drag it around. Let's say we want the light to come from around this angle, which will fit more the image itself. You can see the shadows already going in the other direction. But then to make this even more realistic, we will add reflection on the text. So I'm going to duplicate this 3D layer. Command or Control J will create the duplicate. I'm going to drag it under the other one, and I will just rename this reflection. And then now that layer is selected, I can use the rotate tool to rotate this 3D object in the angle I need. So I'm just going to flip it upside down. I'm aiming for 180 degrees, and then I'm just going to drag it down something like that. When I come back, you can see it almost looks perfect already, but what we need is to reduce the opacity of this layer, and we could even apply gradient masking on it if we want to fade it out. So I'm just going to select the layer again, click on the mask at the bottom, and then use the gradient tool and draw a gradient from top down or bottom to top, depending on the colors you have selected, to fade it out. But don't forget, once again, the best thing is that you are still in Photoshop, so all what we've learned about working with layers still applies, not just the masking. You can also add layer styles. For example, if I want to change the color of the text, I can just simply apply a color overlay layer style by double-clicking on it, choose color overlay, and change the blend mode to multiply. Because we had white text, it will perfectly apply it. I can click OK and alt-click and drag the effect onto the other layer. So now we have the effect also on the reflection. And if you're still not amazed by the 3D capabilities, let me show you the next example where I already prepared this scene with the globe and a bit of animation on it. So I have my timeline and I can show you all the properties you can animate. So when you have a 3D object, you can animate so many different things, even the lights, the materials, the camera position, even the render settings if you want. But if I zoom out on the image a bit and maybe have a little bit more space just to see what happens and start scrubbing around, you can see I have this globe rotating around, and after this point I even made a difference and moved the clouds in different speed to the globe just to test that out. So I was animating a texture in the opposite direction to the object itself. This obviously takes a bit longer time to set up, so I'm not going to go in depth, but I wanted to show you that I also used an outer glow effect on this 3D object and also a levels adjustment layer to pump up the contrast. So once again, combining all those different things that we've learned, adjustment layers, layer styles, timeline panel, with the 3D layers you can create in Photoshop. But I kept the most exciting technique for the last example. And for this, I'm going to use an additional application called Fuse CC. Again, this is only for Creative Cloud users. And currently it's in a preview mode. It's a technology preview, which is almost like an open beta test for this application. But it's already integrated into Photoshop. And all you have to do to make sure it's going to work is that in the preferences in Photoshop, under technology previews, you turn on the CC 3D animations. There will be also another one called Design Space, which we will try in another video. But for now, I'm just going to open Fuse, which is that separate application, where I already created a 3D model. But here you can make any type of characters from female to male to young to old and really customize every little detail you want. And you can even add custom clothing, hair, shoes, and so on and so forth. And of course you can turn your character around, see it from all kinds of angles. And then when you're ready, you can save it into your CC libraries. Now I already went ahead and did that. So I will come back to Photoshop and close my current documents. Then I go to the libraries option and choose 3D models. So this is the start workspace where I can already open up existing files that I saved into my libraries. So there's the 3D girl asset. I'm just going to double click on that, which will open that up. And you will see that the model is imported. We won't need the timeline for this yet. I can zoom closer and we can already start moving her around. So if I select the skeleton, which is the 3D object, I can use the move tool and use the same techniques that we've done before. So turning her around, moving it into an angle, something like that. Now this is called the T-pose, so she looks really stiff at the moment, but we can add properties on it. So we can choose, for example, jumping in place or female standing talking on phone. And then these are not just simple poses, but they are actually animations. So if we bring back the timeline and we scrub through it, you can see that we have the character animated. We can also deselect the layer so we don't see all the outlines around it. So that's how it looks at the moment. But then, of course, we could make all kinds of other changes. For example, place an image in the background. So if I go to File, Place Embedded, I can choose this image, for example, place it, increase its size, and then we can just drag the 3D shape layer above it. We can also make her tiny bit smaller and then use the options to place her exactly here on this street. Now, of course, I could make more changes. For example, changing the shadow. So for that, we can select the light source by clicking on this icon here and changing the light source. But if the shadow doesn't align with her, that means that she's under the ground plane. So we can always select the model. And from the properties panel, we select the coordinates and choose move to ground. So if we want to make sure that the shadow is aligned to the photograph in the background, we will have to move the whole view. So selecting the current view, we will move the whole thing down like that. And once again, we can select the light source and align it so it will fit the image. I think something like that can work. And now if we move back to the timeline panel, we can make sure that the background image is visible all throughout the animation. And now we have her calling someone standing in front of this image. If we just wanted a still with this character in the image, we could just keep on using this and maybe even rasterize this 3D object. But you can also render it to have a better quality version of it. By selecting the 3D layer, you can click on this icon here and that will make a much better render from it. But as you can see, Photoshop has so much to offer when it comes to working with 3D layers. And it's definitely one of those areas worth exploring more if you feel like this is something that you might need in your projects. But that's all I wanted to show you about the 3D technologies. Now, let's come back to photographs and look at a workflow that's more useful for photographers, combining Photoshop with Lightroom.